Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Julian Jaynes, the archaeologist of consciousness itself. Together and apart, they traced the evolution of the human mind through vastly different territories, one mapping the timeless depths of psyche, the other excavating the historical emergence of interior experience. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the nature of inner voices and mythic consciousness, one seeing eternal archetypal patterns emerging from humanity's collective depths, the other discovering a radical rupture in human experience when consciousness broke free from bicameral command. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness and its mysterious origins. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Jaynes as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. The year is 1875, and in the village of Keswil, Switzerland, beside the waters of Lake Constance, Carl Jung enters a world still humming with the certainty of scientific progress and the lingering presence of ancestral mysteries. His childhood unfolds in a landscape where Protestant rationality meets the darker currents of peasant superstition, where his father's theological doubts whisper through the parsonage walls, where dreams arrive with the weight of visitations rather than mere neural misfiring. Jung grows up between two worlds, one foot planted in the empirical certainty of the coming 20th century, the other rooted in something older, something that speaks in the language of visions and symbols and inexplicable knowings. From his earliest years, Jung experiences consciousness not as a single unified thing, but as a multiplicity, a parliament of inner voices and presences. He speaks of his personality number 1 and personality number 2, the former a schoolboy navigating the mundane world of lessons and social expectations, the latter an ancient wise man who seems to possess knowledge far beyond a child's years. These were not merely metaphors for Jung. They felt real, substantial, as though he contained within himself both the immediate present and something reaching back through centuries, perhaps millennia. This experience of multiplicity, of inner figures who speak and guide and contradict, would become the foundation of Jung's life work. When he encountered the mentally ill patients at the Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich at the turn of the 20th century, he recognized in their fragmented psyches something he had glimpsed in his own depths. Their voices, their autonomous complexes, their possession by figures from myth and dream, these were not simply symptoms of disease, but revelations of the psyche's fundamental architecture. Jung's great insight, developed over decades of clinical work and personal exploration, was that consciousness rests upon layers of unconscious material, and that this unconscious is not merely personal but collective, shared, inherited. The archetypes, those primordial patterns of human experience, speak through dreams and visions and creative inspiration, giving form to the formless depths of the human soul. The psyche, for Jung, was ancient beyond measure, its foundations laid down in the earliest stirrings of human awareness, perhaps even earlier, in the evolutionary depths where our ancestors first began to separate inner from outer, subject from object, self from world. By the time Jung reached his middle years, having broken with Freud and endured his own confrontation with the unconscious during his period of creative illness, he had constructed a comprehensive vision of the human psyche as a timeless realm. The archetypes, the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the great mother, the self, these were eternal structures, patterns woven into the very fabric of human being. They spoke to every generation in the language of myth and symbol, unchanged in their essence, even as their surface expressions adapted to cultural contexts. Jung's psychology proposed that consciousness emerged from and remained forever in dialogue with these deeper layers. The process of individuation, the central task of human development, in his view, required acknowledging and integrating the autonomous figures that populate the inner world. These figures were not to be dismissed as hallucinations or primitive thinking, but honored as the very voices through which the self communicates with the ego, through which wholeness attempts to manifest in the fragmentary world of conscious awareness. Now, shift forward through time, across the Atlantic, to the birth of another child destined to ask profound questions about the nature of consciousness. Julian Jaynes enters the world on February 27th, 1920, in West Newton, Massachusetts, into an era when psychology has established itself as a science, when behaviorism promises to explain all human action through stimulus and response, when the mysteries Jung explored seem increasingly quaint in the harsh light of laboratory empiricism. Jaynes grows up in an intellectual climate far removed from Jung's. Swiss mysticism. America in the 1920s and 30s buzzes with industrial confidence and scientific optimism. The mind, many believe, will soon be fully explained, its mechanisms laid bare, its depths illuminated by the steady advance of objective inquiry. There is little room in this worldview for archetypes or collective unconscious, for symbolic thinking or numinous experience. What cannot be measured, observed, and replicated holds little value in the laboratories where psychology seeks legitimacy among the hard sciences. Yet Jaynes carries his own form of radical questioning. His intellectual formation happens during and after World War II, a period when the certainties of civilization lie shattered and humanity confronts its capacity for mechanized horror. He studies English literature, then shifts to psychology, drawn perhaps by the same question that haunted Jung. What is consciousness? What does it mean to say, I am? And crucially, in Jaynes's formulation, has it always been this way? Where Jung assumed consciousness was ancient, evolving gradually from pre-human forms through millennia of human development, Jaynes began to suspect something far more radical. What if consciousness, in the sense of introspective self-awareness, the ability to narrate one's own mental states, to generate an interior analog of the external world, what if this was recent? Not millions of years old, not even tens of thousands, but emerging perhaps only 3,000 years ago in the relatively brief span between ancient civilizations and our own? The idea gestated slowly through Jaynes's academic career. He taught at Princeton, studied animal behavior, published papers on various topics in psychology and ethology. But the big question remained, deepening with each passing year. How do we know consciousness is old? We assume it because we possess it, because we cannot imagine existence without that interior narrator commenting on experience, creating mental spaces, rehearsing conversations, experiencing ourselves as subjects in our own mental theater. But what if this assumption blinds us to a profound truth about human history? Jaynes began reading ancient texts with new eyes. The Iliad became not just literature but psychological evidence. He noticed something strange in Homer's epic. The characters never truly deliberate internally. When decisions must be made, gods appear and command. When inspiration strikes, it arrives as an external voice. Achilles does not decide to restrain his anger through internal reasoning. Athena appears and physically stops his hand from drawing his sword. The heroes of the Iliad act. They feel. They perceive the world with stunning vividness, but they do not introspect. They do not possess what we would recognize as interior mental space. This observation might be dismissed as merely a literary convention, a stylistic choice by Homer, but Jaynes pushed deeper. He examined archaeological evidence from ancient Mesopotamia, from pre-Columbian America, from civilizations around the world. He studied the architecture of ancient temples, the evolution of writing, the testimony of documents spanning the crucial period from roughly 1500 BCE to 500 BCE, and everywhere he looked, he found evidence of a different kind of mind. The bicameral mind theory took shape slowly, carefully, with an audacity that would eventually shock and perplex the psychological establishment. Jaynes proposed that ancient humans, until roughly the time of the breakdown of Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE, possessed a fundamentally different cognitive architecture than modern humans. Their brains were organized such that, during times of stress or decision-making, the right hemisphere would generate auditory hallucinations interpreted as the voices of gods, chiefs, or deceased ancestors. These voices provided guidance, commands, instructions for action. The left hemisphere, the dominant side controlling speech and action, would receive these commands and obey them. This was not consciousness in the modern sense. There was no interior space, no sense of a continuous I observing and narrating experience. Instead, there was what Jaynes called the bicameral mind, a two-chambered mentality, where volition arose not from internal deliberation, but from auditory commands experienced as coming from external divine sources. The breakdown of this bicameral mind, Jaynes argued, occurred during the catastrophic upheavals of the late 2nd millennium BCE. As civilizations collapsed, as refugees mixed populations, as writing spread and changed human cognition, the old certainty of divine voices began to fail. In the chaos, humans were forced to develop new cognitive strategies. They learned to generate internal mental spaces, to create metaphorical eyes that could observe and narrate experience, to imagine the perspectives of others, to remember past and project future in a way the bicameral mind could not. Consciousness, in Jaynes's radical formulation, was not a biological given, but a learned cultural achievement, emerging through the crisis of the bicameral breakdown and spreading gradually through human populations. The profound nostalgia for divine guidance found in later religious texts, the complaints in the Bible that God no longer speaks as he once did, the elaborate rituals developed to induce prophetic trances, these reflected humanity's grief at losing the immediate certainty of divine voices and struggling to adapt to the lonely interiority of conscious awareness. By the time Jaynes published The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind in 1976, Jung had been dead for 15 years. They never met, never corresponded, moved in entirely different intellectual circles. Jung's influence flowed primarily through depth, psychology, mythology studies, and the therapeutic world. Jaynes positioned himself firmly within experimental and cognitive psychology, building his case through textual analysis, neuroscience, and historical evidence. Yet their works, emerging from such different foundations, circle remarkably similar mysteries. Both took seriously the reality of inner voices and autonomous figures. Both recognized that something profound separates ancient and modern mentality. Both understood that myth and religion preserve crucial information about human psychology. Both challenged the assumption that consciousness is a simple, unified, eternal feature of human existence. The contexts that shaped them reveal much about their different approaches. Jung came of age when Europe still believed in depth, in hidden meanings, in the reality of the spiritual realm. His father was a pastor. His mother spoke of seeing ghosts. His culture retained living connections to pre-industrial ways of knowing. When Jung proposed that gods and demons might be real as psychological entities, as archetypal forces, his audience had conceptual frameworks to receive such ideas. Jaynes emerged from mid-20th century American academia, where materialism reigned and anything smacking of mysticism was suspect. To be taken seriously, he needed to ground his radical ideas in observable evidence, in neuroscience, in historical documentation. He could not simply assert that ancient peoples experienced reality differently. He needed to build a case that would convince skeptical scientists. His theory, however outlandish its implications, was clothed in the language of cognitive science and evolutionary psychology. Consider how differently they approached similar source material. Both Jung and Jaynes studied ancient texts intensively, seeking clues to the nature of consciousness and its development. But where Jung read mythologically, symbolically, seeing in ancient stories the eternal patterns of the psyche projected onto cosmic screens, Jaynes read historically, literally, seeing in the same stories evidence of actual cognitive differences. When Jung encountered the voice of God speaking to Abraham or Moses, he understood this as an encounter with the archetype of the self, the voice of wholeness breaking into consciousness. The specific historical question of whether ancient peoples literally heard such voices in a hallucinatory sense interested him less than the universal psychological pattern the story encoded. The God voice was real as psyche, as autonomous complex, as numinous other dwelling in the depths of every human soul. When Jaynes encountered the same biblical passages, he saw historical documentation of bicameral voices. The certainty with which ancient texts report direct divine communication, the matter-of-fact tone suggesting no surprise or disbelief, the absence of any sense that such voices might be merely subjective, these indicated to Jaynes that ancient peoples actually heard auditory hallucinations they interpreted as gods. The voices were real as neurology, as actually occurring auditory experiences generated by the right hemisphere and received by the left as external commands. One reads myth as eternal psychology, the other as historical evidence. One seeks the timeless patterns beneath cultural variation. The other seeks the historical rupture that created those very patterns. And yet they are both circling the same profound mystery of multiplicity within the human mind, the way consciousness seems to be in dialogue with something else, some other voice or presence that both is and is not ourselves. The late 1890s found Jung working at the Burgosli under the direction of Eugen Bleuler. studying patients diagnosed with dementia praecox, what we now call schizophrenia. These patients heard voices, saw visions, believed themselves to be in communication with gods or demons or dead relatives. The psychiatric establishment of Jung's time viewed these symptoms as pure pathology, meaningless static generated by diseased brains. But Jung listened differently. He heard in the voices of the mad something recognizable, something that connected to his own inner multiplicity and to the religious visions recorded throughout history. When a patient declared she was Mary Magdalene or channeled the voice of an ancient king, Jung did not simply dismiss this as biological malfunction. He saw in it the eruption of autonomous complexes, archetypal material breaking through a weakened ego structure. His word association experiments provided empirical evidence for these autonomous complexes. By measuring reaction times and emotional responses to stimulus words, Jung demonstrated that the psyche contains distinct centers of psychological energy, complexes that react independently of conscious will. These complexes clustered around archetypal cores, mother, father, shadow, anima, and could, in extreme cases, possess sufficient autonomy to manifest as fully formed inner figures or even voices. The crucial Jungian insight was that this multiplicity was not inherently pathological. Every psyche contains these autonomous elements. The healthy ego maintains a working relationship with them, listening to their voices in dreams and fantasies, integrating their energies through the hard work of individuation. The psychotic person differs not in kind, but in degree. The autonomous complexes have overwhelmed ego consciousness, fragmenting the personality structure. Jung developed active imagination as a method for consciously engaging these inner figures. Rather than being passively overwhelmed by them, one could learn to dialogue with them, to recognize them as aspects of the total self-seeking acknowledgement and integration. The anima might appear as a dream woman offering guidance. The shadow might manifest as a threatening figure in a fantasy. The wise old man might speak in an intuition that seems to come from outside oneself. All were real as psychological entities, possessing genuine autonomy while remaining part of the psyche's greater wholeness. This understanding of inner multiplicity as potentially healthy and even necessary for psychological development set Jung apart from most psychiatric thought of his era. Where others saw only disintegration and disease, Jung recognized a form of inner dialogue that connected modern humans to shamanic traditions, to mystical practices, to the creative process itself. The artist who speaks of their muse, the religious devotee who hears God's voice, the analysand who encounters a wise figure in active imagination, all were engaging with the same autonomous structures of the psyche that manifest more chaotically in psychosis. Fast forward to the 1960s and 70s, when Jaynes was developing his bicameral theory. He too recognized the significance of hearing voices, but his interpretation diverged radically from Jung's. For Jaynes, schizophrenia represented not the eruption of timeless archetypes, but a partial relapse to the bicameral mentality. The voices schizophrenics hear, he proposed, arise from the same neural architecture that once generated divine commands for all of humanity. In the bicameral mind, the right hemisphere speech areas, which in modern humans are typically less dominant, actively generated verbal commands during times of stress. These commands crossed to the left hemisphere and were experienced as auditory hallucinations, the voices of gods and ancestors. When the bicameral mind broke down, this neural pathway became suppressed in most people, overridden by the development of conscious introspection. But in schizophrenia, Jaynes argued, This ancient mechanism reactivates. The voices return, now experienced as pathological because they clash with the conscious interior space modern humans have developed. Jaynes pointed to the specific characteristics of schizophrenic hallucinations as evidence. They are typically auditory rather than visual. They often command or comment on actions. They are experienced as coming from outside, as alien to the self. They frequently claim divine or authoritative sources. They arise especially during stress, when decision-making is difficult. All these features match what we would expect from bicameral voices, right hemisphere-generated commands, breaking into left hemisphere awareness. Moreover, Jaynes noted that schizophrenia seems to be a relatively modern disease, with few clear historical cases before the 17th century. This timing fit his theory perfectly. If consciousness emerged gradually from roughly 1000 BCE to 500 BCE, then only in the modern era, when consciousness became thoroughly established across cultures, would bicameral relapse appear as obvious pathology. In earlier periods, experiencing commanding voices would be normal, or at least not distinctly abnormal. The very category of madness, as hearing voices that others don't hear, can only emerge in a fully conscious society where such voices are no longer universal. The implications of these divergent interpretations ripple outward in profound ways. If Jung is right, then working with inner voices therapeutically means learning to recognize their archetypal nature, to understand what aspect of the self seeks expression through them, to integrate their energy into conscious life. The goal is dialogue, relationship, eventually synthesis into a more complete personality. If Jaynes is right, then inner voices represent either an ancient mentality that should remain suppressed in favor of conscious introspection, or evidence that consciousness itself is a fragile cultural achievement that can break down under stress. The goal is not dialogue with voices, but strengthening the conscious interior space that makes such voices unnecessary. Yet notice a strange convergence in practice. Jungian analysts often encourage patients to personify and dialogue with autonomous aspects of psyche, to have imaginal conversations with dream figures, to ask, "What does my anger want to tell me?" and receive answers in the second person. This is strikingly similar to the bicameral experience of receiving guidance from seemingly external voices. The difference is conscious framing. The Jungian knows these voices are aspects of self, while the bicameral person experienced them as genuinely other. And Jaynes, despite viewing consciousness as an achievement, recognized that it came at a cost. The bicameral person acted with certainty, guided by divine voices that remove the agonizing burden of decision-making. The conscious person faces existential anxiety, must choose without certainty, bears responsibility for actions that might fail. The nostalgia for divine guidance found throughout religious history reflects a genuine loss, a grief for a mode of being that possessed its own integrity and peace. Both thinkers, then, recognized that the modern Western model of unified rational consciousness is not the only way to be human, and perhaps not even the optimal way. Jung saw health in multiplicity, acknowledged and integrated. Jaynes saw in ancient bicamerality a functional system that served its time well. Both understood that the isolated, purely rational ego, beloved of Enlightenment philosophy, is an illusion, or at best, an extreme and potentially pathological development. The 1890s and early 1900s saw Jung delving deep into mythology, folklore, and comparative religion. He read voraciously in Gnostic texts, alchemical treatises, Eastern scriptures, and the myths of tribal peoples studied by anthropologists. Everywhere he found the same patterns repeated in endless variation, creation myths following similar arcs, hero journeys mirroring the process of ego development, divine couples representing the union of opposites, descent into underworlds, echoing the confrontation with shadow material. This comparative study convinced Jung that myths were not primitive attempts at scientific explanation, nor mere entertaining stories, but rather spontaneous expressions of the collective unconscious. The archetypes clothe themselves in the images available within a culture, but the underlying patterns remain constant. The Great Mother appears as Demeter in Greece, Isis in Egypt, Kali in India. Yet, the archetype of the nurturing yet devouring maternal principle persists beneath these different masks. For Jung, this meant that myths give us direct access to the deepest structures of the psyche. By studying mythology, we learn about ourselves at the most fundamental level. The gods and goddesses are not dead relics of primitive thinking, but living forces within every human soul, active now as much as 3,000 years ago. When we dream of flying or falling, when we feel called to adventure or retreat to solitude, when we fall in love or rage in anger, archetypal patterns are constellating in our psyches, the same patterns that generated the myths our ancestors told by firelight. This perspective allowed Jung to read ancient texts as eternally relevant psychological documents. The Odyssey was not just a story about ancient Greece, but a map of the individuation process, with Odysseus representing the ego navigating between the extremes of inflation and deflation, learning wisdom through trials, ultimately returning home transformed. The Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish depicted not just ancient cosmology, but the eternal psychological process of consciousness emerging from chaos, ego separating from the unconscious matrix. The symbols through which myths spoke were, for Jung, the natural language of the psyche. The unconscious thinks not in words and linear logic, but in images, in feelings, in synchronistic connections. Dreams speak in this symbolic language, as do works of art, religious visions, and the products of creative imagination. To understand the psyche requires learning this symbolic language, recognizing that when a dragon appears in a dream, it represents something other than a literal reptile, perhaps the devouring mother archetype, or repressed instinctual energy, or the guardian of treasure hoarded in the unconscious. Jung spent decades elaborating the symbolic meaning of various archetypal images, drawing on his vast reading in mythology, religion, and alchemy. Water represents the unconscious itself. The wise old man embodies the archetype of meaning and spiritual guidance. The divine child represents the potential for renewal and transformation. These meanings were not arbitrary or merely cultural, but arose from the way human beings experience these phenomena at a visceral, pre-verbal level. Now consider Jaynes approaching similar mythological material with his bicameral hypothesis. He too saw myths as psychological documents, but of a very different kind. Rather than timeless symbolic expressions, Jaynes read myths as historical records of the transition from bicameral to conscious mentality. The Epic of Gilgamesh became crucial evidence in Jaynes's framework. This ancient Mesopotamian text, parts of which date back nearly 4,000 years, seemed to Jaynes to capture the bicameral world at its height and beginning to crack. The early parts of the epic show Gilgamesh and Enkidu acting decisively with divine guidance, hearing the voices of gods clearly. But later sections, especially the final tablet, shows something new. Gilgamesh reflecting on mortality, asking philosophical questions, engaging in the kind of internal deliberation absent in the earlier sections. Jaynes argued that Gilgamesh reflected historical reality, not in its specific events, but in its psychological atmosphere. The text was composed over centuries, with later editions reflecting the gradual development of conscious introspection. The story of Gilgamesh's grief after Enkidu's death and his subsequent quest for immortality represented the new human condition, awareness of death, of personal mortality, of the isolated self facing its own end. These concerns would be impossible for a bicameral person, who possessed no sense of continuous personal identity extending into future and past. Similarly, Jaynes read the Iliad and Odyssey as documenting the transition period. The Iliad, he argued, shows bicameral mentality in operation heroes, acting on divine command, gods intervening directly, no real introspection or internal debate. The Odyssey, likely composed later, shows the emergence of consciousness. Odysseus is cunning, deceptive, capable of planning and internal deliberation in ways Achilles never demonstrates. The difference is not just one of character, but of cognitive capacity. Odysseus possesses interior mental space that allows him to imagine various possibilities and choose strategically. The crucial point for Jaynes was that these texts were not primarily symbolic, but documentary. When Homer says Athena appeared and stopped Achilles from killing Agamemnon, Jaynes took this at face value as describing an actual auditory hallucination. The bicameral person really did hear a voice, really did experience it as coming from outside, really did attribute it to a god. The symbolic reading, which sees this as metaphor for internal restraint or better judgment, imposes modern consciousness back onto an ancient text that means something more literal and strange. Similarly, with other ancient texts, the gods speaking from sacred groves, from idols and temples, from burning bushes, these were not poetic inventions, but descriptions of genuine hallucinatory experiences generated by bicameral brains. The elaborate temple architecture of ancient civilizations, with their inner sanctums and acoustic engineering, was designed to facilitate these auditory hallucinations. The idol in the temple's heart was not mere symbol, but the physical focus that helped generate the god's voice. In Jaynes's reading, the flood myths found across many cultures might record the catastrophic disruptions of the late 2nd millennium BCE that destroyed bicameral civilizations. The biblical story of the fall from Eden represented humanity's grief at losing bicameral certainty and entering the anxious world of conscious decision-making. The Tower of Babel's story recorded the confusion when bicameral voices failed and people could no longer understand divine commands, experiencing this as a sudden multiplication of languages. Where Jung saw eternal psychological patterns, Jaynes saw specific historical transitions. Where Jung read symbolically, Jaynes read literally. Yet both recognized that ancient texts preserve crucial psychological information that reveals something essential about human nature and its development. The divide between their interpretations comes into sharp focus when we consider religious experience itself. Jung's entire approach to religion was grounded in the reality of numinous experience. He witnessed numerous patients undergo spontaneous religious experiences during analysis, often at crucial moments of psychological transformation. These experiences were not pathological unless they overwhelmed ego structure. Rather, they represented the self, the archetype of wholeness, breaking into conscious awareness. Jung's own visions during his confrontation with the unconscious included encounters with figures like Philemon, a wise old man with wings who became his spiritual guide. Jung understood Philemon as an autonomous complex, an aspect of his own psyche that nonetheless possessed genuine independent reality within the psychological realm. He could dialogue with Philemon, receive guidance, even disagree with him. The relationship was real, meaningful, transformative, even though Jung knew Philemon was not an external entity. This understanding of religious experiences, an encounter with autonomous aspects of the psyche, allowed Jung to honor the reality of mystical experience without requiring belief in literal supernatural beings. The gods were real as psychological forces, as archetypes, as the way the deepest structures of psyche present themselves to consciousness. Prayer was a form of active imagination, a dialogue with the inner divine. Religious rituals worked psychologically by activating archetypal patterns and facilitating the flow of energy between conscious and unconscious. For Jaynes, religious experience had a different explanation, rooted in bicameral vestiges. Prophetic experiences, shamanic trances, mystical voices, these represented temporary reactivations of the ancient bicameral system. Through fasting, meditation, drumming, hallucinogens, or other consciousness-altering practices, the old neural pathways that generated divine voices could be reactivated. This explained why religious experiences across cultures share certain features: auditory hallucinations of commanding voices, sense of divine presence, loss of normal self-awareness, compulsion to obey. The crucial difference is that Jung saw these experiences as encounters with timeless archetypal depths, always available, and ultimately more real than ego consciousness. Jaynes saw them as temporary regressions to an older mentality, meaningful in historical context, but representing a mode of cognition that humanity has outgrown. One approach sacralizes inner multiplicity as the voice of the self. The other historicizes it as neural vestige. Yet in practice, both approaches led their respective followers toward careful attention to altered states and inner voices. Jungian analysts cultivate the capacity to slip between ordinary consciousness and imaginal awareness, to have one foot in ego consciousness and one in the realm of autonomous complexes. Jaynes's followers studied hypnosis, auditory hallucinations, and trance states, seeking to understand how consciousness could be temporarily suspended to allow older forms of mentality to emerge. The question arises, are they describing the same phenomena in different languages? When a Jungian analysand encounters a wise inner figure during active imagination, and when a research subject in a Jaynesian study hallucinates a commanding voice under specific experimental conditions, are these the same experience? The phenomenology might be identical. An auditory or visual presence felt as other, communicating guidance or information, possessing autonomous intelligence. Only the interpretation differs. Jung would say the experience taps into archetypal structures that have always existed in human psyche. Jaynes would say it temporarily reactivates neural pathways that once generated bicameral voices. One explanation is vertical, reaching down into timeless depths. The other is horizontal, reaching back through historical time. But both acknowledge the reality of the experience itself, its profound impact on the experiencer, and its connection to the deepest questions of human identity and meaning. The middle decades of Jung's life saw him developing his theory of individuation, the process by which a person becomes fully themselves, integrating conscious and unconscious elements into a greater wholeness. This process typically accelerates in midlife, when the ego's youthful certainties begin to crack and questions of meaning become urgent. Dreams grow more intense. Symbols press upward from unconscious depths. The carefully constructed persona begins to feel like a prison rather than protection. Individuation requires encountering and integrating the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we have disowned and projected onto others. It requires recognizing and relating to the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspects of psyche that mediate between ego and unconscious. Eventually, if the process unfolds fully, it leads to encounter with the self, the archetype of wholeness that both contains and transcends ego consciousness. This self, in Jung's elaborate formulation, is paradoxical. It is both the center and the circumference of personality, both our innermost essence and the totality that includes all aspects of psyche. It manifests in dreams and visions as mandalas, as divine figures, as symbols of quaternity and wholeness. Encounter with the self brings a sense of meaning and purpose that transcends ego needs and wants, aligning the individual with something larger and more enduring than personal concerns. The process Jung described is essentially religious in nature, even when it occurs outside traditional religious frameworks. It involves death and rebirth of ego identity, sacrifice of limited views for larger perspectives, submission to forces greater than personal will. The alchemical symbolism Jung studied extensively provided metaphors for this transformation. The nigredo, or blackening, representing confrontation with shadow. The albedo, or whitening, representing purification. The rubedo, or reddening, representing the integration of passion and spirit. Crucially, Jung saw individuation as the telos, the goal toward which the psyche naturally moves. We are pulled toward wholeness by the self, even when ego consciousness resists. Symptoms, synchronicities, dreams, and life crises all serve this larger process, breaking down inadequate ego structures so that something more complete can emerge. The psyche possesses its own wisdom, its own intentionality, beyond conscious understanding. Now imagine Jaynes observing this process through his bicameral lens. The autonomous figures encountered during individuation, the shadow, the anima, the wise old man, would appear to him as temporary reactivations of bicameral voices. The transcendent experiences Jung associated with self-encounters would be moments when consciousness partially breaks down and allows more ancient mental structures to briefly operate. But here the comparison grows complex, because Jaynes's theory suggests that full bicameral mentality lacks the kind of continuous sense of I that Jung's individuation process assumes. The ego that must die and be reborn in individuation is itself a product of consciousness. A bicameral person, having no interior narrator, no sense of continuous personal identity, would have nothing to individuate. The very project of integration presupposes the divided conscious mind that needs integrating. Perhaps we might say that what Jung described as individuation could only begin to occur after the bicameral breakdown. Only once consciousness emerged, creating the isolated ego, did the problem of wholeness arise. The bicameral person was, in a sense, already whole, acting in unity with divine commands, untroubled by the existential anxiety of decision-making. But this wholeness was unconscious, unreflective. The conscious person, divided and anxious, now faces the possibility of conscious wholeness. wholeness that includes and integrates both conscious and unconscious elements. If we follow this line of thinking, Jung's individuation process represents humanity's attempt to consciously regain what was lost in the bicameral breakdown, the sense of guidance, meaning, and participation in something larger than ego. But it attempts this regaining at a higher level, including rather than excluding consciousness. The individuated person is not simply bicameral again, but rather contains both consciousness and connection to its deeper sources. Jaynes himself said relatively little about individuation or psychological development. His theory focused primarily on explaining the historical emergence of consciousness and its effects, less on prescribing optimal ways to live with the consciousness we have inherited. But one could imagine a Jaynesian psychology that acknowledges both the achievement of consciousness and its costs, seeking to develop practices that allow access to older forms of mentality without surrendering conscious awareness. This would look remarkably similar to what Jung actually practiced: active imagination, attention to dreams, cultivation of symbolic thinking. The difference would remain primarily one of interpretation. The Jungian says we access timeless archetypes. The Jaynesian says we reactivate historical neural structures. But the practical result: enhanced creativity, better decision-making, greater sense of meaning might be identical. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, as Jung elaborated his late work on synchronicity, alchemy, and the symbolism of the self, he increasingly emphasized the relativization of the ego. The healthy, mature person, in Jung's view, recognizes ego as servant rather than master, as the consciousness component of a much larger psychic totality. This did not mean ego annihilation, but rather ego relationship to the self, conscious cooperation with the deeper intentionality of psyche. Such a view directly challenges Western Enlightenment values that celebrate autonomous rational will, the individual as sole captain of their fate. Jung's psychology is deeply countercultural in insisting that we are not primarily rational agents, but rather creatures of symbol and instinct, that our apparent choices emerge from depths we barely comprehend, that health requires acknowledging powers within us greater than conscious intent. Jaynes, writing in the 1970s, articulated a somewhat similar critique of the purely rational agent. His theories suggested that consciousness itself is not the source of decision-making, but rather a narrator that retrospectively claims credit for actions generated by unconscious processes. The conscious I believes it decides, but in fact decisions emerge from neurological and environmental factors that consciousness only later justifies with reasons. This parallels Jung's understanding that ego consciousness does not create or control psychic content, but rather relates to forces emerging from personal and collective unconscious. Both thinkers challenge the assumption that consciousness equals total mental life, that what we're aware of exhausts what's occurring psychologically. Both insisted on the primacy of unconscious processes and the derivative nature of conscious awareness, yet they arrived at this conclusion from opposite directions. Jung built his psychology from therapeutic experience with patients, from his own inner explorations, from mythological and religious traditions that always assumed humanity participates in realities beyond rational control. His was essentially a bottom-up approach, starting with phenomena and developing theory to account for them. Jaynes approached from cognitive science, neurology, and historical textual analysis. His was more top-down, constructing a theoretical framework and then finding evidence to support it. He worked in an academic context that demanded rigorous argumentation and empirical justification. Jung worked in a clinical and literary context that valued insight, intuition, and lived experience. The difference in approach meant their work appealed to different audiences and generated different forms of controversy. Jung's critics dismissed him as mystical, unscientific, too influenced by religious thinking. Jaynes's critics attacked his historical claims, his interpretation of texts, his neuroscientific speculations. Jung found his audience among therapists, artists, and spiritual seekers. Jaynes influenced consciousness studies, cognitive archaeology, and philosophers of mind. But both remain controversial precisely because they challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature. Jung asks us to acknowledge that gods and demons are psychologically real, that we contain depths beyond conscious plumbing, that rationality is a late and fragile achievement resting on irrational foundations. Jaynes asks us to consider that our interior mental life is not ancient or inevitable, but historically contingent, that our ancestors experienced reality in ways we can barely imagine, that consciousness might be a learned cultural skill rather than biological given. Either way, the comfortable certainty of the unified rational self dissolves. We are strangers to ourselves, inheritors of evolutionary and historical forces we do not control, participating in forms of mentality whose origins and operations remain mysterious. Let us turn now to examine more closely how these two frameworks would interpret specific phenomena that both encountered. Consider the voice-hearing experience in schizophrenia, which we touched on earlier but deserves deeper exploration. A young woman sits in a hospital room. She has not slept properly in days. Voices command her, sometimes gentle, sometimes harsh. They comment on her actions, predict catastrophe, occasionally offer guidance. She knows, in some part of herself, that others do not hear these voices, that this marks her as ill. Yet the voices possess undeniable reality to her. They have personality, consistency, authority. She can identify different voices, the critical father, the seductive stranger, the weeping child. They speak when they wish, not when she summons them. They are autonomous, alien, other. Jung would sit with this woman and listen carefully to what the voices say. He would not dismiss them as mere symptoms, but would try to understand what unconscious material they represent. Perhaps the critical father voice reflects an internalized parental complex, grown autonomous and tyrannical. Perhaps the weeping child represents her own wounded innocence, split off and now speaking from exile. Perhaps the seductive stranger is an animus figure, promising transformation but threatening to overwhelm ego boundaries. The Jungian approach would be to gradually strengthen the ego's capacity to relate to these voices without being possessed by them. Through careful therapeutic work, the woman might learn to recognize the voices as aspects of herself, to dialogue with them, to hear their legitimate concerns while maintaining her own center. The voices might never entirely disappear, but they could be integrated, their energy channeled into creative life rather than destructive fragmentation. The goal would not be to silence the voices through medication alone, though medication might help stabilize the situation enough for therapeutic work to proceed. Rather, the goal would be psychological integration, the scattered aspects of psyche coming into relationship with each other, forming a greater wholeness that includes, but does not eliminate, multiplicity. Jaynes would understand the same woman's experience as a bicameral relapse. The neural pathways that once generated divine voices for all of humanity remain present in modern brains, though typically suppressed by the dominance of conscious introspection. Under stress, genetic predisposition, developmental trauma, social isolation, neurochemical imbalances, these pathways can reactivate. The right hemisphere begins generating auditory commands experienced by the left hemisphere as external voices. The specific content of the voices reflects the woman's personal history and cultural context, but the mechanism is ancient. Her bicameral voices command and comment just as gods once commanded Bronze Age humans. The distress she experiences comes not from the voices themselves, but from the conflict between bicameral voice hearing and conscious introspection. In a bicameral society, her voices would be honored as divine communication. In a conscious society, they mark her as broken. The Jaynesian therapeutic approach would focus on strengthening conscious interior space, helping the woman develop robust internal narratives that can contextualize the voices as neural events rather than external authorities. Cognitive behavioral approaches that challenge the voice's claims to authority align with this framework. The goal is to render the voices powerless by removing belief in their external origin, reducing them to neurological noise that can be ignored. Yet notice a strange convergence. The Jungian approach of dialogue and integration requires first establishing that the voices are internal aspects of psyche, not external entities, essentially the same recognition the Jaynesian approach seeks. And the Jaynesian approach, in acknowledging that the voices arise from real neural structures with evolutionary history, grants them a certain dignity beyond mere malfunction. Both approaches reject simple dismissal of voice hearing as meaningless symptom to be eliminated without understanding. Perhaps the deepest difference lies in what each framework suggests about optimal human development. For Jung, encountering autonomous voices and learning to relate to them is part of normal individuation, at least in attenuated form. We should expect to have inner dialogues, to feel addressed by something other than ego, to experience the psyche as a community of figures rather than a monarchy of rational will. The schizophrenic differs in degree, not kind. The voices are too strong, too autonomous, overwhelming rather than enriching ego consciousness. For Jaynes, the appearance of voices represents regression from the conscious state that is properly human in the modern era. While he acknowledged the costs of consciousness, his framework suggests that strengthening interior mental space and maintaining unified subjective awareness is the optimal condition. Voices, when they occur, should be understood as atavistic neural events, not cultivated as sources of guidance. Yet Jaynes also recognized that creativity, religious experience, and even ordinary decision-making might benefit from temporary relaxation of consciousness to allow older mental structures to contribute. Perhaps the ideal is not constant conscious control, but rather facility in moving between conscious and more ancient modes of mentality as situations warrant. This begins to sound remarkably like Jung's vision of the individuated person who can consciously engage with unconscious content without being overwhelmed by it. Both frameworks, pursued to their conclusions, seem to converge on a model of human flourishing that includes multiplicity, acknowledges non-conscious sources of wisdom, and relativizes the ego without eliminating it. Another phenomenon both frameworks illuminate is the nature of dreams. Dreams fascinated both thinkers, though they approached them from different angles. Jung devoted enormous attention to dream interpretation throughout his career. He saw dreams as direct communications from the unconscious, expressing in symbolic language what consciousness has neglected or repressed. Dreams compensate one-sided conscious attitudes, present situations from unexpected angles, offer guidance from the self about the individuation process. They speak in the language of symbol and metaphor because that is the natural language of the psyche, more immediate and expressive than linear verbal thought. The figures encountered in dreams represent autonomous aspects of psyche, shadows, anima or animus figures, wise guides, threatening enemies. These are not merely random neuron firings or day residue processing, but meaningful expressions of psychic reality. A dream about being chased by a dark figure might symbolize confrontation with shadow material. A dream of flying might represent spiritual aspiration or manic inflation, depending on context. A dream of descending into dark water might signal the need for ego to surrender to unconscious transformation. Jung developed an elaborate methodology for working with dreams, emphasizing amplification of dream symbols through mythological parallels, attention to the dream's overall structure and feeling tone, and the dreamer's associations to specific images. Dreams within a series particularly interested him, as they often show a clear process unfolding over time. The psyche working through a problem, moving toward resolution or compensation. Crucially, Jung rejected universal dream dictionaries. The same symbol might mean different things for different individuals in different contexts. The snake in one person's dream might represent healing and transformation, in another's, phallic sexuality, in a third's, deadly danger. Understanding required knowing the dreamer's life context, conscious situation, and overall psychological state. Jaynes said relatively little about dreams compared to Jung, but his framework offers an interesting perspective. In the bicameral era, Jaynes suggested, dreams may have been indistinguishable from waking hallucinations of God voices, or perhaps even absent entirely. The interior mental space required for dreaming, as we experience it, the ability to create an imaginal scenario and observe it, may have emerged along with consciousness itself. This is speculative, as we have no direct evidence of how ancient peoples experienced sleep and dreams. But Jaynes noted that early historical references to dreams often treat them as messages from gods or visitations by external beings, not as purely internal mental events. The shift toward understanding dreams as subjective experiences happens gradually through the first millennium BCE, paralleling the development of consciousness. In the Jaynesian view, modern dreams might represent a hybrid state where consciousness partially relaxes its grip and allows more ancient forms of mentality to operate. The bizarre logic of dreams, the way dream events seem to happen to us rather than being created by us, the appearance of autonomous figures who speak and act independently, these features resemble bicameral mentality more than conscious narration. When we remember and narrate dreams upon waking, we impose conscious structure on non-conscious experience. The dream itself unfolds in a kind of bicameral space, but the dream report is a conscious construction, an attempt to translate non-conscious experience into narrative form. This might explain why dreams are so difficult to describe fully. We're trying to capture in conscious language something that occurred outside conscious modes of cognition. Both frameworks, then, see dreams as revealing something usually hidden from conscious awareness. For Jung, dreams reveal the unconscious psyche, eternal and archetypal. For Jaynes, dreams reveal older forms of mentality, historical and neurological. One points down into depth, the other back through time. But both agree that dreams deserve careful attention as windows into dimensions of human experience that transcend ordinary waking consciousness. Consider also the phenomenon of inspiration and creativity, which both thinkers addressed in their work. Artists, writers, musicians, and scientists frequently report that their best work comes not from conscious effort but from something else, a muse, a flow state, an intuition that arrives fully formed. Jung understood creativity as arising from the collective unconscious, from archetypal patterns seeking expression through individual human vessels. The artist is gripped by an archetype, becomes its instrument, gives form to forces much larger than personal ego. Great art resonates across cultures and centuries because it expresses these universal patterns, allowing others to recognize in the artwork their own deepest psychic realities. This explained for Jung why certain symbols recur spontaneously in creative works without the artist necessarily knowing their archetypal history. A modern artist might paint a mandala without ever having studied Eastern symbolism, because the mandala form expresses the archetype of the self present in every human psyche. A novelist might create characters that perfectly embody anima or shadow without consciously intending archetypal representation, because the archetypes are the patterns through which we instinctively understand human nature. The creative process, in Jung's view, requires ego to step aside and allow unconscious material to flow through. This is not passive reception, but rather active cooperation. The ego must maintain enough presence to give form to what emerges, while avoiding so much control that the unconscious cannot express itself freely. The greatest art occurs when conscious skill and unconscious inspiration work in harmony. Jaynes approached creativity differently, but with some overlap. He suggested that the feeling of inspiration, of receiving ideas from outside oneself, might reflect bicameral vestiges, moments when the right hemisphere generates novel combinations and presents them to the left hemisphere as if from an external source. The muse is not an archetypal figure, but the right brain speaking to the left in the ancient manner. This explained why creativity is often enhanced by practices that reduce normal consciousness, taking walks, showering, falling asleep, using mild intoxicants. These activities allow the right hemisphere more freedom to generate novel connections without left hemisphere criticism and control. The ideas that arrive feel foreign, gifted rather than earned, because they emerge from neural processes outside conscious awareness. Jaynes also noted that metaphorical thinking, which he considered essential to consciousness, plays a crucial role in creativity. The ability to see one thing in terms of another, to make unexpected connections between dissimilar domains, allows the creation of new meaning and understanding. Consciousness emerged through metaphorical thinking, and consciousness in turn enables increasingly sophisticated metaphors that generate art, science, and cultural innovation. Both frameworks recognize that creativity involves accessing mental states and processes beyond ordinary conscious control. Whether we call the source collective unconscious or right hemisphere processing, whether we see muses as archetypes or neural voices, the practical result is similar. Creativity requires a certain loosening of ego boundaries, an openness to what arrives from beyond conscious intention. Perhaps we can say that Jung provided the phenomenology of the creative experience, what it feels like, what it means psychologically, how it relates to the larger project of individuation. Jaynes provided a potential neurological and evolutionary mechanism for how such experiences might occur. The two approaches complement rather than contradict, offering different levels of explanation for the same phenomena. Let us shift our focus now to their understanding of mythology itself, the stories cultures tell to make sense of human existence. Both recognize mythology as profoundly important, but they read myths in strikingly different ways. For Jung, mythology represented the collective unconscious made visible. Myths are spontaneous products of the human psyche, arising independently across cultures because they express universal patterns. The hero's journey appears in Greek, Norse, Hindu, and indigenous American myths not through cultural transmission but through archetypal necessity. Humans everywhere face similar developmental challenges: separation from the mother, confrontation with mortality, integration of shadow, discovery of meaning. Myths give narrative shape to these universal experiences. Jung read myths neither as historical accounts nor as primitive science, but as psychological truth. When a myth speaks of a hero descending to the underworld, this describes the ego's necessary confrontation with unconscious material. When a myth tells of a divine marriage between sky god and earth goddess, this symbolizes the union of opposites that individuation requires. The literal truth or falsity of mythic events matters far less than their psychological accuracy. This approach allowed Jung to find personal relevance in myths from any culture or era. A Swiss psychiatrist in the 20th century could learn about his own psyche from Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories or Aztec creation myths because the archetypes they express are human universals. Working with myths therapeutically meant helping patients recognize their own psychological processes in mythic narratives, seeing their personal struggles as instantiations of timeless patterns. Jung particularly valued myths that had been preserved across long transmission, suggesting their psychological potency was so great that countless retellings could not eliminate their essential meaning. The Christian story of incarnation, death, and resurrection expressed for Jung the individuation process in nearly perfect symbolic form, the self descending into manifestation, the ego dying to its limited identity, the resurrection of the whole person. Whether one believed these events literally happened mattered far less than recognizing their psychological truth. Jaynes read the same myths as historical documents, but documents of a special kind, records of the bicameral mind and its breakdown. He saw mythology not as timeless patterns, but as memory traces of the cognitive revolution that created consciousness. Creation myths, in Jaynes's reading, often describe the end of bicameral certainty and the beginning of conscious questioning. Eden represents the bicameral state, where humans lived in direct obedient relationship with divine voices. The fall represents the breakdown of bicamerality and the emergence of self-consciousness, bringing knowledge of good and evil, the burden of decision-making without divine command. The nostalgia for Paradise Lost is historically grounded grief for the lost bicameral mentality. Similarly, flood myths might record the catastrophic disruptions of the late Bronze Age that destroyed bicameral civilizations and forced the development of consciousness. The hero myths Jaynes read as describing the emergence of conscious protagonists who act through internal deliberation rather than divine command. Odysseus represents the new conscious human. Achilles represents the old bicameral hero whose motivations are simpler and whose relationship with gods is more direct. The Greek myths about Olympian gods meddling in human affairs, Jaynes suggested, reflected a transitional period when bicameral voices were failing and becoming less reliable. The gods' commands became contradictory, different gods giving different instructions, reflecting the breakdown of the old neural system. The development of philosophy in ancient Greece represented humanity's attempt to find new foundations for action and meaning now that divine voices could no longer be relied upon. Thus, Jaynes and Jung both saw mythology as revealing profound truths about human consciousness, but truths of very different kinds. Jung found eternal psychological patterns. Jaynes found historical cognitive transformation. Jung read metaphorically. Jaynes read historically. Yet both treated myths with profound seriousness, rejecting any dismissal of myth as primitive error or entertaining fiction. An interesting question arises. Could both be right? Might myths serve double duty, both encoding historical memories of cognitive transition and expressing timeless psychological patterns? Perhaps the reason certain myths resonate so powerfully is precisely because they operate on both levels simultaneously. They are historically true as records of bicameral breakdown, and psychologically true as expressions of universal human experiences. The story of the fall could be historical memory of consciousness emerging and psychological truth about every individual's development, from innocent childhood dependency to anxious adult responsibility. These meanings need not exclude each other. Indeed, the power of the myth might derive from its multiple layers of meaning. Its ability to speak simultaneously to historical memory encoded in cultural tradition and personal psychological experience encoded in archetypal patterns. Such a synthesis would require modifying both frameworks somewhat. Jung would need to acknowledge that some myths are not timeless, but specific to the historical period of consciousness's emergence. Jaynes would need to grant that myths acquire additional psychological meanings beyond their historical origins, that they do express truths about human experience across time and culture. Both thinkers, in their different ways, rebelled against the modern tendency to dismiss myth as pre-scientific error, to see humanity's ancient stories as embarrassing primitiveness to be outgrown. Both insisted that myths contain wisdom, that they reveal truths about human nature not accessible through purely rational empirical investigation. In this, they were allies, even if their specific interpretations diverged. The question of consciousness itself, its nature and origins, forms the heart of both frameworks and deserves extended reflection. What is consciousness? When did it arise? Is it one thing or many things? What does it do, and what are its limits? For Jung, consciousness was the lit space of ego awareness, a relatively small and recent part of the total psyche. Below and around consciousness lies the vast unconscious, both personal and collective, containing infinitely more psychic content than consciousness can ever integrate. Consciousness emerges from unconscious foundations, remains dependent on unconscious support, and returns to unconscious depths in sleep, trance, and psychosis. Jung traced consciousness back through evolution, seeing it develop gradually from animal awareness through increasing complexity. Even animals possess some form of consciousness, though lacking the reflexive self-awareness and symbolic capacity of humans. Human consciousness emerged gradually, probably over hundreds of thousands or millions of years, as brain complexity increased and social life became more sophisticated. The crucial development for Jung was not consciousness per se, but ego consciousness, the sense of I that separates subject from object, observer from observed. This ego consciousness creates the illusion of unity and control, imagining itself as master of the psyche, when in fact it is a relatively late and fragile achievement, floating on vast unconscious depths. Jung saw the development of ego consciousness as both gain and loss. Consciousness allows choice, culture, moral development, and the possibility of individuation, but it also alienates humanity from instinctual wisdom, creates the split between conscious and unconscious that generates neurosis and fosters the illusion of human mastery that leads to hubris and destructiveness. The goal of individuation is not to strengthen ego consciousness alone, but to bring it into proper relationship with unconscious depths. The individuated person maintains ego awareness while also remaining open to unconscious wisdom, neither identified with ego nor dissolved into unconscious, but holding the tension between opposites. Jaynes proposed something far more radical. Consciousness, in his sense, meant specifically the interior mental space where we narrate our experience, create metaphorical representations of reality, imagine ourselves from external perspectives, and experience ourselves as continuous subjects. This kind of consciousness, he argued, is not ancient but emerged suddenly in evolutionary terms, roughly 3,000 years ago. Before consciousness arose, humans functioned through the bicameral mind, no interior space, no sense of continuous I, but instead direct guidance from hallucinated voices experienced as gods. This mentality was not primitive or inferior, but simply different, adequate for its time. The bicameral person could learn, remember, act, skillfully create culture. They lacked only the specifically modern form of reflexive self-awareness we call consciousness. When bicameral civilizations collapsed around 1200 BCE, the ensuing chaos forced human brains to develop new cognitive strategies. Consciousness emerged not through gradual evolution but through cultural learning spread through populations by imitation and necessity. Once developed, consciousness allowed unprecedented flexibility, planning capacity, and cultural innovation, but it came at the cost of existential anxiety, decision paralysis, and loss of connection to divine guidance. In Jaynes's model, consciousness is not a biological given, but a cultural achievement, learned and maintained through language and cultural practices. A child raised without language and culture might never develop full consciousness. The wild children, found periodically throughout history, raised by animals or in isolation, seem to lack normal interior mental life, supporting Jaynes's view that consciousness requires specific cultural transmission. The gap between these two conceptions of consciousness is vast. Jung saw it as ancient, evolving over vast time, foundational to humanity. Jaynes saw it as recent, emerging suddenly, culturally learned. Jung saw it as one part of a larger psyche. Jaynes saw it as the defining characteristic that separates modern humans from our ancestors. Yet both agreed on certain crucial points. Consciousness is not the totality of mind. Much, perhaps most, mental functioning occurs outside conscious awareness. The assumption that consciousness controls behavior is largely illusory. We are driven by processes we do not understand or control. And consciousness, however defined, creates problems for humans even as it enables achievements. Perhaps the disagreement is partly definitional. When Jung spoke of consciousness, he often meant simply awareness, the quality of being awake and perceiving, which clearly extends far back in evolutionary time. When Jaynes spoke of consciousness, he meant specifically the interior, narratizing mental space that allows reflexive self-awareness. These might be different phenomena, related but distinct. We could imagine a synthesis. Awareness and perception are ancient, evolutionarily deep, shared with other complex animals. The specifically human form of consciousness that Jaynes described, the interior mental space, the metaphorical I, the ability to imagine ourselves from outside, this might indeed be relatively recent, emerging through the process Jaynes described. Jung's consciousness would be old. Jaynes's consciousness would be new. Such a synthesis would suggest that the collective unconscious Jung described is very old, containing evolutionary patterns and instincts. But the specific form of ego consciousness that confronts and attempts to integrate unconscious material would be historically recent individuation, in this view, becomes possible only after consciousness in Jaynes's sense emerges, because it requires the divided psyche that needs integrating. This would also explain why mythology appears to change character over time. The oldest myths, from the period Jaynes identifies as bicameral, lack interior deliberation and feature direct divine intervention. Later myths show increasing psychological complexity, internal conflict, and characters who make decisions through reasoning. This progression reflects the historical emergence of consciousness, while the recurring patterns Jung identified reflect the older archetypal layer beneath. Both thinkers, we should note, were profoundly influenced by the question of what distinguishes humans from other animals. Jung's answer emphasized symbols, collective unconscious, and the possibility of conscious integration with deeper psychic layers. Jaynes's answer emphasized the culturally transmitted interior space of metaphor-based consciousness. Both saw in this distinctively human capacity, both triumph and tragedy, unprecedented power coupled with unique vulnerabilities. As we drift deeper into this exploration, let us consider what each framework suggests about optimal human development and the good life. What does healthy psychological functioning look like from each perspective? Jung's vision of psychological health centered on the individuation process. The healthy person gradually confronts and integrates unconscious material, expanding consciousness not by strengthening ego defenses, but by making conscious what was unconscious. This requires courage to face shadow material, willingness to sacrifice cherished illusions, and openness to dimensions of experience that exceed rational understanding. The individuated person maintains ego consciousness, but relativizes it, recognizing ego as servant of the self rather than master of personality. They develop relationships with autonomous inner figures, honoring their voices without being possessed by them. They live symbolically, seeing in outer events reflections of inner states, finding meaning in coincidence and synchronicity. They participate consciously in the archetypal patterns that shape human existence rather than being blindly driven by them. Such a person possesses what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites until a third thing emerges, a synthesis beyond either pole. They are comfortable with paradox, ambiguity, and uncertainty. They trust the psyche's self-regulating capacity, its tendency to compensate one-sided attitudes and move toward wholeness. Crucially, individuation never ends. It is a lifelong process, perhaps even continuing beyond death in some form Jung was willing to speculate about, but never claim certainty. Each stage of life brings new challenges of integration. The individuated person remains always in dialogue with unconscious depths, always open to further transformation. This vision is deeply countercultural in modern Western society. It rejects the goals of pure rationality, perfect control, and problem-free existence. It suggests that what we call neurosis may be the psyche's attempt to force needed development. It values receptivity as much as agency, being as much as doing, dissent as much as assent. Jaynes offered less explicit guidance about optimal psychological development, but his framework implies certain conclusions. The conscious person has successfully developed interior mental space, can narrate experience, plan for future, learn from past, and imagine multiple possibilities before acting. They understand that their interior voices, when they arise, are neural events rather than divine commands, and can evaluate them critically rather than obeying automatically. Psychological health in a Jaynesian framework might involve robust consciousness that maintains its narratizing function under stress, preventing regression to bicameral voice hearing. It would involve understanding consciousness itself as an achievement to be maintained through cultural practices, through language use, through education that trains interior mental space. But Jaynes also recognized the costs of consciousness, the anxiety, the decision paralysis, the loss of certainty. A truly healthy Jaynesian consciousness might involve learning to temporarily relax the constant interior narration, allowing older mental structures to contribute to creativity and problem-solving without surrendering to them completely. This begins to resemble Jung's emphasis on maintaining relationship between conscious and unconscious, rather than letting either dominate absolutely. Both frameworks resist the modern notion that psychological health equals constant happiness and absence of symptoms. Jung explicitly rejected this, seeing necessary suffering as part of individuation. Jaynes, though less focused on therapy, clearly understood that consciousness brings unavoidable, existential challenges that cannot be solved but only endured and given meaning through cultural frameworks. Both also emphasize the importance of meaning, of finding or creating frameworks that make life worth living. For Jung, meaning arose from aligning with the self's purposes, from participating consciously in the eternal patterns of human existence. For Jaynes, meaning had to be culturally created and transmitted, since consciousness itself generates the question of meaning that bicameral mentality never asked. Perhaps we can say that Jung offered a depth approach to meaning, finding it by going deeper into psyche, discovering the archetypal patterns that connect us to all humanity across time. Jaynes offered a historical approach, understanding that our cognitive architecture creates certain problems and opportunities, and that cultures must develop narratives and practices adequate to consciousness's demands. Both would agree, I think, that the modern Western approach of seeking happiness through external acquisition and ego gratification is deeply misguided. Both understood that the psyche has its own requirements that cannot be satisfied through wealth, power, or pleasure alone. Both knew that something deeper calls, whether we name it self or recognize it as consciousness's need for meaning structures. The question of religion, which we touched on earlier, deserves further reflection. Both Jung and Jaynes spent enormous energy trying to understand religious experience and religious traditions. Their conclusions differed dramatically, yet both took religion with profound seriousness in an intellectual climate increasingly dismissive of spiritual concerns. Jung, especially in his later work, argued that humans have a fundamental religious need, an instinct for meaning and connection with the numinous. The archetypes, particularly the self, have religious character. They inspire awe, demand submission, transform personality. Religious symbols and practices arise spontaneously across cultures because they give form to these universal psychological realities. Jung made a careful distinction, not always well understood, between religion and creed. Religion, as living psychological experience, he valued deeply. Creed, as rigid dogma, he saw as defensive, an attempt to contain and control religious experience that ultimately deadens it. True religion involves direct encounter with numinous archetypes, with the mysterium tremendum that Rudolf Otto described. Such encounters cannot be controlled or domesticated. They change the person fundamentally. Christianity interested Jung particularly because its central symbols, incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, Trinity, virgin birth, expressed psychological processes with remarkable accuracy. Whether these events happened historically mattered less than their psychological truth. The story of Christ's life, death, and resurrection maps the individuation process, the ego's sacrifice and transformation in service to the self. But Jung also recognized that Christianity, as actually practiced in the modern West, has largely lost its transformative power. The symbols have become mere concepts, believed or disbelieved intellectually, but no longer experienced as living realities. The churches have become social institutions, maintaining moral codes rather than vessels for transformative religious experience. This created, in Jung's view, a spiritual crisis in Western civilization. Cut off from living religious experience, unable to believe traditional Christian doctrines, modern people suffer a meaning crisis that manifests as neurosis, addiction, and destructive political movements. The collective unconscious still constellates religious archetypes, but with no conscious framework to receive them. They erupt chaotically or are projected onto inadequate secular substitutes, like nationalism or consumerism. Jung saw his psychology as partly an attempt to restore religious experience in modern psychological terms. Active imagination, dream work, and individuation provide ways to encounter the numinous without requiring belief in literal supernatural beings. The self can be experienced and related to without deciding whether it transcends individual psyche or not. The symbols can work psychologically whether or not they correspond to metaphysical realities. Jaynes approached religion from a completely different angle, reading religious traditions as evidence for bicameral mentality and its breakdown. Religion, in his view, arose as humanity's attempt to maintain contact with the divine voices that had guided bicameral civilizations. As those voices faded and failed, increasingly elaborate methods were developed to induce them: temples, idols, rituals, sacrifices, altered states. The Bible particularly fascinated Jaynes as a record spanning the bicameral era and its breakdown. The earliest biblical texts showed direct divine command with no surprise or questioning. By the time of the later prophets and wisdom literature, we see increasing complaint that God no longer speaks clearly, that his presence has withdrawn. The prophetic tradition represents increasingly desperate attempts to hear the divine voice that once came naturally. Jesus, in Jaynes's reading, may have been one of the last bicameral people, hearing the voice of God with the directness that had been normal centuries earlier. His authority and certainty derive from still possessing the old mentality. His followers, already conscious in the modern sense, could not replicate his direct divine contact and instead developed theology to explain and transmit his teachings. The development of Christian theology through the early centuries CE represents consciousness trying to make sense of and systematize what had been direct experience. The Trinity, transubstantiation, incarnation, these elaborate doctrines arose because consciousness demands explanation, seeks to understand rather than simply obey. The bicameral person needed no theology. They heard God's voice directly. The conscious person needs theology precisely because the voice is gone. Modern religiosity, for Jaynes, represents either conscious belief in propositions about reality, which can never satisfy as deeply as direct experience, or attempts to induce bicameral vestigial experiences through prayer, meditation, glossolalia, and other practices. These practices sometimes work, temporarily reactivating the neural pathways that generate inner voices, providing the certainty and meaning that consciousness alone cannot supply. Thus, Jung and Jaynes both recognized that religion addresses deep human needs that secular rationalism cannot satisfy. But Jung saw those needs as timeless and archetypal, while Jaynes saw them as specific to conscious mentality, arising from the loss of bicameral certainty. Jung wanted to restore religious experience through psychological understanding. Jaynes primarily wanted to understand religion historically, though he recognized its ongoing psychological necessity. The disagreement reflects their fundamental difference about whether the psyche is timeless or historical. Jung's archetypes are eternal. If we meet them consciously, we connect with something unchanging beneath the flux of time. Jaynes's consciousness is historical. We are fundamentally different from our ancestors, and religion reflects our attempt to cope with that difference. Yet in practice, both approaches might lead to similar religious attitudes. Both would value contemplative practices that quiet discursive thought and allow contact with non-rational dimensions of mind. Both would distrust rigid fundamentalism that mistakes literal belief for living experience. Both would recognize that humans need what religion provides, even if we conceptualize that need differently. An interesting thought experiment. Imagine Jung and Jaynes actually meeting, sitting together in quiet conversation, each presenting their framework to the other. What would that dialogue have revealed? Jung might begin by acknowledging the appeal of Jaynes's historical specificity. The bicameral mind theory does seem to explain certain puzzles in ancient texts, the apparent matter-of-factness of divine voices, the gradual emergence of interior deliberation, the nostalgia for lost divine guidance. Jung read those same texts symbolically, but perhaps Jaynes is right that they also record historical cognitive changes. But Jung would press Jaynes on the question of whether consciousness could really emerge so suddenly. The archaeological evidence Jaynes marshals is suggestive but not conclusive. Alternative explanations might account for changes in religious practice and textual evidence without requiring such a radical cognitive rupture. And if consciousness is culturally learned, what prevents societies from losing it? Why does it seem so stable? Once established? More fundamentally, Jung might question whether Jaynes has really escaped the problem of timeless psyche. Even if consciousness emerged only 3,000 years ago, something was there before bicameral mind, yes, but operating through brains and psyches. Where did the bicameral architecture come from? Surely it too evolved over vast evolutionary time, and if that ancient architecture remains latent in modern brains, capable of reactivation, then perhaps what Jaynes calls bicameral voices are what Jung calls archetypal autonomous complexes, the same phenomena viewed through different theoretical lenses. Jung might suggest that his theory can encompass Jaynes's observations. Perhaps what Jaynes identifies as consciousness's historical emergence was actually a major transformation in the ego's relationship with autonomous complexes. Rather than being possessed by inner voices, bicameral mentality, humans learn to recognize them as inner figures and develop conscious relationship with them. The basic architecture autonomous complexes that speak with their own voices remains constant, but the way ego consciousness relates to them transforms. Jaynes, for his part, would likely press Jung on the question of evidence. The archetypes are appealing constructs, but how do we know they're universal rather than culturally transmitted? Cross-cultural similarities in myths might reflect cultural diffusion rather than innate psychic structures. And isn't the very concept of timeless, unconscious archetypes suspiciously similar to Plato's eternal forms an appealing philosophical idea, but difficult to demonstrate empirically? Moreover, Jaynes might note that Jung's approach tends to read modern consciousness back into the ancient world. When Jung interprets Odysseus as individuating or Gilgamesh as confronting mortality, he assumes they possess the kind of reflexive self-awareness that might not have existed yet. The bicameral mind theory takes seriously the possibility that ancient people were not just less developed versions of us, but fundamentally different cognitive entities. Jaynes would acknowledge the power of Jung's clinical observations. Patients do encounter autonomous inner figures during therapy. Dreams do present personalities and voices that seem independent of ego. But rather than concluding these are eternal archetypes, might they not be vestiges of bicameral mentality? The right hemisphere still has the capacity to generate voices and characters. Usually this remains suppressed, but it can emerge in therapy, dreams, and psychosis. Both might find common ground in recognizing that the modern Western ego is not the pinnacle of psychological development. Jung insists that isolated ego consciousness is pathological, that health requires relationship with unconscious depths. Jaynes notes that consciousness came at great cost, that older forms of mentality had their own integrity. Both resist the Enlightenment fantasy of pure reason triumphant. They might also agree that modern psychology has been too narrow, too focused on behavior and cognition while ignoring the depths and complexities of inner experience. Jung's depth psychology and Jaynes's cognitive archaeology both insist that the mind is stranger, deeper, and more interesting than mainstream psychology acknowledges. Where they likely could not reach agreement is on the status of spiritual experience. For Jung, numinous encounters with archetypes connect us to something genuinely transcendent, even if we locate it within psyche rather than metaphysical heaven. For Jaynes, spiritual experiences are neurological events, meaningful but ultimately reducible to brain states and cultural conditioning. This disagreement reflects different philosophical commitments about the nature of reality itself. Jung was essentially an idealist, believing that psyche is as real as matter, perhaps more so. Jaynes was fundamentally a materialist, believing that consciousness supervenes on physical brain states and emerges from them. These starting points profoundly shape how they interpret similar observations. Yet even here, synthesis might be possible. Perhaps psyche and neurology are two valid levels of description for the same reality, like wave and particle descriptions of light. Jung describes the phenomenology and meaning of inner experience. Jaynes describes potential mechanisms and historical development. Both levels matter. Neither is complete alone. Let us consider now some specific phenomena where their frameworks offer competing explanations, exploring how each would interpret experiences that many people report. Take the experience of conversion. Whether religious or to other ideologies, a person feels called, encounters a presence or message that transforms their understanding, becomes suddenly certain of truths they had previously doubted. Their personality reorganizes around this new center. They speak of being reborn, of finally finding their true self or purpose. Jung would understand conversion as an archetypal experience, the self breaking into ego consciousness with transformative force. The specific content of the conversion, Christian, Buddhist, political, even conversion to psychoanalysis itself, matters less than the underlying pattern. The ego surrenders its limited identity and submits to something greater, experiencing this as death and rebirth. The archetype of transformation constellates, reorganizing personality around a new center. Jung would caution against identifying too completely with the conversion experience, seeing it as a necessary but not final stage of development. The convert often becomes inflated, possessed by the archetype, needing to do its work in the world with evangelical fervor. Later, if development continues, comes integration. The convert becomes more grounded, less certain, able to hold the tension between old and new selves. Jaynes might interpret the same conversion experience as involving temporary reactivation of bicameral voices. In the moment of conversion, the person hears or feels a commanding presence that speaks with absolute authority, exactly like the divine voices of the bicameral era. This voice resolves their conflicts, provides certainty, removes the burden of conscious decision-making. The relief is immense consciousness, with its anxiety and doubt temporarily gives way to bicameral certainty. The content of what the voice says reflects the person's cultural context and previous preoccupations, but the mechanism is ancient. Practices that induce conversion experiences, prolonged prayer, emotional preaching, sleep deprivation, sensory overload, work partly by suppressing normal consciousness and allowing bicameral structures to activate. The post-conversion period involves integrating this bicameral experience into conscious life. The convert must develop theological explanations, moral frameworks, and practices that maintain connection to the initial certainty while functioning in ordinary conscious society. Some converts remain partially bicameral, hearing continuing guidance from God or other inner authorities. Others lose the immediate experience but keep the conscious belief system it generated. Both explanations acknowledge the reality and power of conversion experiences while interpreting their meaning differently. Are we encountering eternal archetypes or activating ancient neural structures? Does the experience connect us to transpersonal depths or reveal our evolutionary history? Different answers, yet both take seriously something modern secular psychology often dismisses as mere emotion or social pressure. Consider also the experience of artistic creation at its most intense. Many artists describe periods of flow where the work seems to create itself through them. They serve as channels or vessels for something that arrives complete, needing only to be captured and given form. The greatest works, artists often say, feel like gifts rather than achievements. Jung would see in this the collective unconscious speaking through the individual artist. The archetypes seek embodiment, use the artist's skill and material to manifest in concrete form. This explains why great art feels both utterly unique and strangely familiar. Unique in its specific expression, familiar because it expresses universal patterns we all recognize in our depths. The artist in the grip of creation is possessed by an archetype, merged with it temporarily. After the work is complete, the artist returns to ordinary ego consciousness, often exhausted and sometimes unable to explain or analyze what they have created. They were the instrument, not the composer, the channel, not the source. Jung valued art profoundly as one of the primary ways archetypal material becomes available to collective consciousness. Great literature, painting, music, these give form to the formless depths, allowing others to glimpse what might otherwise remain unconscious. The artist serves humanity by bringing back reports from the collective unconscious, enriching culture with images and stories that resonate across generations. Jaynes would interpret artistic flow somewhat differently. The right hemisphere excels at pattern recognition, at generating novel combinations, at seeing connections that linear conscious thought misses. When consciousness relaxes its controlling grip, the right hemisphere can work freely, producing insights and creations that then arrive in conscious awareness as if from outside. The artist feels they are receiving the work from a muse because consciousness experiences right hemisphere products as coming from elsewhere. This is the same mechanism that generated bicameral divine voices, now serving creative rather than decisional functions. The great artist has learned to cultivate this capacity, to regularly access right hemisphere contributions while maintaining enough conscious control to shape and refine what emerges. The reason great art resonates across cultures might reflect not timeless archetypes, but rather common features of human cognition and experience. We all have right hemispheres. We all face birth, death, love, loss, meaning. Art that speaks to these universal aspects of human existence will naturally resonate widely, not because it expresses eternal patterns, but because it addresses experiences inherent in the human condition. Again, both frameworks honor the mysterious nature of creativity while proposing different mechanisms. One points to collective depths, the other to bilateral brain structure. One says we're accessing something eternal, the other something historical. Yet both recognize that creativity requires accessing mental processes beyond conscious, rational thought. Consider one more phenomenon: the uncanny or numinous experience of meaningful coincidence. What Jung termed synchronicity. A person thinks of a long-lost friend, and moments later that friend calls. Someone dreams of an event, and the next day it occurs. A person struggling with a decision encounters a series of seeming signs, all pointing one direction. Jung took such experiences extremely seriously, devoting one of his final major works to elaborating the principle of synchronicity. He proposed that psyche and matter are not absolutely separate, but rather two aspects of an underlying unus mundus, a unified reality. At certain moments, especially during intense psychological states, this underlying unity becomes apparent in meaningful coincidences between inner and outer events. Synchronicities often occur around archetypal moments: birth, death, love, major life transitions. They seem to confirm that one is on the right path, or warn of danger, or reveal hidden meanings. Jung believed paying attention to synchronistic events helped one align with the self's purposes, navigating by a deeper wisdom than conscious planning. Importantly, Jung distinguished synchronicity from causality. Synchronistic events are causally connected, related not through ordinary cause and effect, but through meaning. The dreamed event does not cause the waking event. Both arise from the underlying unity that occasionally becomes visible. This required Jung to propose additions to our physical worldview, suggesting that meaning itself is an organizing principle in nature. Jaynes had little to say directly about synchronicity, but his framework would likely interpret such experiences as products of consciousness itself. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns, so good that we see patterns where none exist. Consciousness, being metaphor-based, constantly seeks meaning and connection. When we're emotionally aroused or psychologically stressed, we become even more prone to seeing significance in random events. The friend who calls after we thought of them would be explained by availability, bias, and selective memory. We forget the many times we thought of people who didn't call, remembering only the hits. The dream that predicts an event might reflect unconscious processing of available information, picking up cues that conscious awareness missed. The series of signs pointing one direction result from our tendency to seek confirmatory evidence for decisions we've already unconsciously made. This doesn't mean synchronistic experiences have no value, even in a Jaynesian framework. They might represent consciousness working to create coherent narratives that resolve conflicts and enable decisive action. If we need permission or confirmation to make a difficult choice, synchronistic interpretations of random events can provide that permission. They work psychologically, even if they don't reflect any underlying unity of mind and matter. Here, the gap between frameworks seems widest. Jung makes metaphysical claims about the nature of reality itself, proposing that meaning is woven into the cosmos. Jaynes remains strictly naturalistic, attributing synchronistic experiences to psychological mechanisms rather than cosmic connection. One finds evidence of design or purpose, the other sees our meaning-making capacity at work. Yet even here, both acknowledge that humans need meaning, that we are creatures who seek and create connections between events. The question is whether those connections reflect something real or only our need to find pattern and purpose. Different answers, but agreement that meaning matters profoundly to human well-being. As this exploration deepens, we should pause to note the risks and costs in both frameworks. Neither Jung nor Jaynes offered simple solutions or guaranteed happiness. Both recognize that understanding human psychology reveals profound challenges without easy resolution. Jung's psychology, pursued deeply, can lead to what might be called archetypal possession. The person becomes so fascinated with inner figures, so skilled at active imagination, that they lose grounding in ordinary reality. They speak constantly in symbolic language, see archetypes everywhere, perhaps drift into a form of waking dream where everything has numinous significance. This represents not the goal of individuation, but its caricature, inflation rather than integration. Jung warned against this, emphasizing that individuation requires maintaining ego consciousness even while expanding it. One must be able to move between ordinary and symbolic consciousness, neither trapped in mundane literalism nor lost in archetypal inflation. The goal is to include both. Hold the tension, remain grounded while staying open to depth. There's also a risk that Jungian psychology becomes too comfortable with pathology, too quick to find meaning in symptoms rather than alleviating suffering. Not every psychological problem reveals deep archetypal wisdom. Sometimes people need practical help with anxiety or depression, not elaborate symbolic interpretation. The shadow of Jungian psychology is the tendency to romanticize suffering and see health in what might actually be breakdown requiring intervention. Jaynes's framework carries different risks. If consciousness is culturally learned and maintained, what happens when cultural frameworks collapse? The modern crisis of meaning, the sense of alienation and anxiety pervading post-industrial societies, might reflect not just loss of religious tradition, but actual degradation of consciousness itself. Without robust cultural narratives and practices, might consciousness become weaker, more prone to regress to bicameral voice hearing or other primitive mentalities? Jaynes suggested that schizophrenia rates might increase as consciousness becomes less stable, and that authoritarian political movements might represent collective regress to bicameral mentality following a voice that tells us what to think and do, relieving the burden of conscious decision-making. The modern mass rallies, the charismatic leaders speaking with absolute certainty, the followers who surrender critical thinking, these might be bicameral dynamics erupting in conscious societies. Moreover, if the bicameral mind was not inherently inferior, just different, then consciousness's triumph represents loss as well as gain. We might have sacrificed forms of intuition, connection to nature, social harmony, and spiritual certainty that bicameral mentality provided. The project becomes not just maintaining consciousness, but finding ways to integrate its achievements with what was lost in the bicameral breakdown. Both frameworks thus resist simple optimism. Jung saw modern humanity as alienated from soul depths, inflated by rationalism, headed toward catastrophe unless we recover relationship with unconscious wisdom. Jaynes saw consciousness as fragile, culturally dependent, perhaps failing in modern context to provide the meaning and stability humans need. Neither offered a purely progressive vision where we move steadily toward enlightenment. What they shared was the conviction that understanding consciousness, whether as recent achievement or eternal dialogue with depths, is crucial for navigating modern life. Self-knowledge in both frameworks requires acknowledging that we are not unified rational agents, but rather multiplicities, divided between conscious and unconscious, between present awareness and evolutionary history, between ego and something greater. This shared insight has profound implications for how we live. It suggests humility about our ability to control outcomes, since so much emerges from beyond conscious awareness. It recommends practices that honor non-rational dimensions, dreams, art, meditation, therapy, time and nature, encounters with the sacred. It warns against societies that become too rational, too controlled, too cut off from depths and roots. Both Jung and Jaynes, in their different ways, were prophets warning of spiritual crisis in technological civilization. Jung saw the collective unconscious erupting chaotically in wars, totalitarianism, and mass neurosis because conscious culture had lost connection to archetypal depths. Jaynes saw consciousness itself threatened by cultural breakdown, with authoritarian and fundamentalist movements offering pseudo-bicameral certainty to replace conscious anxiety. Their diagnoses overlap significantly, even if their ideologies differ. Modern humanity is in crisis, cut off from sources of meaning and stability that sustained previous generations. The solution requires neither simple return to the past nor doubling down on rational control, but rather some new synthesis that includes what was lost while retaining what has been gained. Let us turn now toward the question of death and what lies beyond, a topic both thinkers approached with unusual openness for psychologists. What happens to consciousness after the body dies? Jung speculated carefully about this. Jaynes said little directly, but his framework implies certain conclusions. Jung noted that the unconscious seems not to recognize death as an end. Dreams often feature dead relatives as alive and well. The psyche spontaneously produces imagery of afterlife, rebirth, and continuation. Near-death experiences across cultures show remarkable similarities, suggesting some common psychological process at the boundary of death. Jung took these observations seriously, suggesting that perhaps consciousness continues in some form, perhaps merging back into the collective unconscious from which it emerged. He was careful not to claim certainty, but he was equally unwilling to dismiss the possibility as impossible. If psyche is as real as matter, if it is not simply epiphenomenal to brain states, then perhaps it can exist independently of physical embodiment. The archetypes are eternal, existing beyond any individual instantiation. Perhaps individual consciousness participates in this eternal quality, continuing after bodily death in ways we cannot know from this side of the threshold. Jung's near-death experience after his heart attack in 1944 profoundly affected him. He felt himself leaving his body, viewing Earth from a great height, approaching something he described as almost unbearably beautiful. He was angry when resuscitation brought him back, feeling he had glimpsed something genuine beyond ordinary reality. The experience confirmed his sense that consciousness is not reducible to brain states, that it participates in dimensions that transcend physical existence. For Jung, approaching death consciously was part of individuation. The psyche seems to prepare for death through dreams and fantasies in the final years of life, processing what will be left behind, anticipating transformation. Death is the final mystery that gives life meaning. Knowing we are mortal forces us to ask what we're living. For what legacy of meaning we'll leave? Jaynes's framework offers a starkly different perspective. If consciousness is a cultural achievement dependent on brain function and learned cognitive practices, then death ends it absolutely. When the brain ceases activity, consciousness disappears, not continuing in any form. This is not tragic, but simply factual. Consciousness emerged recently and is fragile, dependent entirely on physical structures that death destroys. Near-death experiences, in a Jaynesian view, would be products of dying brains, final neural activities, creating hallucinations that reflect cultural expectations and bicameral vestiges. The feeling of leaving one's body, traveling through tunnels toward light, encountering deceased relatives, these might be the brain's final bicameral-style hallucinations, generated as brain systems shut down in sequence. The significance of death in a Jaynesian framework is quite different from Jung's. Death is not transformation, but termination. Consciousness exists only in the brief span of individual life, making that span infinitely precious. The meaning we find must be created within time, not discovered through connection to eternal patterns. We must build cultures that help conscious beings face mortality without either bicameral denial or paralyzed anxiety. Yet Jaynes recognized that most humans cannot fully accept consciousness's mortality. We need narratives of continuity, whether religious afterlives or secular legacies. Consciousness itself generates the problem of death by allowing us to imagine our own non-existence, and cultures must provide frameworks that make death bearable. In this way, beliefs about afterlife serve psychological functions, even if factually baseless. The contrast here is almost total. Jung opens toward transcendence, suggesting consciousness participates in eternal dimensions beyond physical life. Jaynes insists on mortality, seeing consciousness as wholly dependent on physical brain states that death ends. One finds comfort in the psyche's eternal depths, the other in consciousness's precious brevity. Which view is correct? We cannot know from this side of death, cannot conduct experiments that would settle the question. Both positions are ultimately metaphysical commitments beyond empirical proof or disproof. We choose based on which resonates with our experience, which helps us live and die with meaning and dignity. But notice that both positions, pursued deeply, lead to similar ethical conclusions. If Jung is right, and we participate in eternal patterns, then how we live matters enormously because it affects the condition in which consciousness returns to collective depths. If Jaynes is right, and we have only brief conscious existence, then how we live matters enormously, because this is our only opportunity. Either way, life demands serious engagement with questions of meaning and value, Both frameworks also suggest that modern Western materialism fails to fully acknowledge what it means to be human. Whether consciousness is eternal dialogue with archetypal depths or recent fragile cultural achievement, it deserves more respect and attention than reduction to merely behavioral or chemical terms. Human beings are not simply complex animals to be conditioned, nor malfunctioning machines to be chemically adjusted, but psychological realities requiring understanding at multiple levels. As we approach the completion of this exploration, let us reflect on what the dialogue between these two great minds reveals about the permanent questions that haunt human existence. Whether or not we accept either framework fully, their conversation illuminates territory that any comprehensive psychology must address. Both Jung and Jaynes force us to confront the multiplicity of inner life. We are not the unified rational agents Enlightenment philosophy imagined. We contain inner voices, autonomous figures, impulses from beyond, conscious awareness. The question is not whether this multiplicity exists, but how we understand and relate to it. Do we see eternal archetypes or historical vestiges, timeless patterns or evolutionary structures? The answer shapes our practices, but does not erase the fundamental reality of inner complexity. Both insist that symbols and myths convey profound truths, not accessible through purely literal, rational discourse. Whether symbols express collective unconscious patterns or preserve cultural memory of cognitive transformations, they deserve careful interpretation, not dismissal as primitive superstition. Modern rationalism's contempt for symbolic thinking impoverishes human experience and cuts us off from dimensions of meaning necessary for well-being. Both recognize that consciousness, whatever its nature and origin, is not the master of the psyche. Most mental activity occurs outside awareness. The sources of creativity, decision-making, moral intuition, and life direction lie beyond conscious access. This should generate humility, caution about claiming certainty, and openness to sources of wisdom that transcend rational calculation. Both see modern Western psychology as too narrow, too quick to dismiss as pathological what might be necessary or revelatory. Hearing voices, seeing visions, experiencing numinous presence, these may be not simply symptoms to be eliminated, but aspects of human experience requiring understanding. Whether we contextualize them as archetypal or bicameral, we must take them seriously as meaningful phenomena. Both frameworks suggest that human history and development are not simple progressions toward enlightenment. Jung saw modern rationalism as dangerous one-sidedness, requiring correction through recovered relationship with unconscious depths. Jaynes saw consciousness as achievement, but costly achievement, bringing anxiety and existential burden along with enhanced capacities. Neither accepted the narrative that we have, moved from primitive error toward final truth. Both recognized profound ambiguity in psychological development. The practical implications for therapy and self-understanding overlap more than the theoretical differences might suggest. Both approaches recommend careful attention to dreams, fantasies, and altered states. Both value practices that allow access to non-rational dimensions, whether we frame this as active imagination or controlled bicameral reactivation. Both emphasize understanding rather than merely suppressing symptoms, finding meaning in psychological distress. Both also warn against too much consciousness, too much rational control. Jung feared ego inflation and dissociation from instinctual wisdom. Jaynes recognized consciousness's tendency toward anxiety and paralysis. Both imply that psychological health involves balance, maintaining conscious awareness while staying connected to deeper or earlier structures that provide guidance and meaning. Where they diverge most profoundly is perhaps not in specific observations, but in philosophical orientation. Jung's psychology is essentially spiritual, finding meaning through connection with eternal depths that transcend individual existence. Jaynes's psychology is essentially historical, finding meaning through understanding our place in cognitive evolution and cultural development. One points toward the eternal, the other toward the temporal, one toward depth, the other toward historical change. Perhaps we need both orientations. The vertical dimension Jung maps descending into collective depths, encountering archetypal wisdom, finding meaning beyond time, addresses real human needs and experiences. The horizontal dimension Jaynes traces, understanding how we came to be conscious, what was lost and gained in cognitive transformation, provides equally important perspective. We exist in both dimensions simultaneously, heirs to evolutionary history and participants in timeless patterns. A mature psychology might integrate both perspectives, recognizing that human experience can be validly described at multiple levels. Neurologically, we are brains with specific evolutionary histories and structural features. Psychologically, we are subjects experiencing meaningful patterns that recur across cultures and time. Culturally, we are products of specific historical developments and transmitted learning. Spiritually, we are beings seeking connection with something greater than individual ego, however we conceptualize that greater thing. Jung and Jaynes each emphasize certain levels while de-emphasizing others. Jung prioritized psychological and spiritual understanding, downplaying historical and cultural specificity. Jaynes prioritized neurological mechanism and historical development, downplaying archetypal patterns and spiritual transcendence. Each saw clearly within their chosen focus, perhaps missing what the other illuminated. The conversation between them, imagined or real, productive or frustrating, reveals the landscape of consciousness in its full complexity. We are neither simply ancient souls carrying eternal wisdom, nor simply biological machines running cultural software. We are both, neither, and something that exceeds these categories. The mystery of consciousness remains despite their combined efforts, inviting continued exploration and wonder. As you drift towards sleep, let the ideas we have explored settle gently into whatever depth receives them. The bicameral voices and archetypal presences, the historical ruptures and eternal patterns, the collective unconscious and evolved brain structures, all these concepts point towards something real, something profound about human nature and its possibilities. Perhaps in your dreams tonight, you will encounter the multiplicity Jung and Jaynes both recognized. Perhaps an inner figure will speak, offering guidance or challenge. Whether you understand this figure as archetype or bicameral vestige matters less than your willingness to listen, to engage, to learn from dimensions of your own psyche that transcend ordinary waking consciousness. Both thinkers invite us into deeper relationship with ourselves, acknowledging that we are larger, stranger, and more mysterious than our egos imagine. Both ask us to take seriously experiences that modern rationalism dismisses: the numinous, the symbolic, the multiplicity of inner voices. Both suggest that wisdom requires humility, recognition that consciousness floats on depths or emerges from histories we only partially comprehend. The project of understanding consciousness continues. Jung and Jaynes contributed major insights but not final answers. Each new generation must take up the questions again, must explore with fresh eyes the mysteries of human awareness and its relationship to what lies beyond or beneath or before awareness. What makes us conscious? When and how did consciousness arise? What is its relationship to the unconscious, to the body, to culture, to whatever may be eternal or transcendent? How should we live, given the particular form of consciousness we possess? What practices and frameworks allow consciousness to flourish while maintaining connection to its sources? These questions have no simple answers, no solutions that close discussion. They are permanent questions as long as consciousness continues to reflect upon itself. Jung and Jaynes kept the questions alive through their particular explorations, preventing premature closure, insisting that consciousness and psyche exceed easy categorization. Their dialogue, whether we reconstruct it across the years that separated them or imagine it as it might have been, reminds us that multiple perspectives on consciousness are not only possible, but necessary. No single framework captures the full reality of human psychological existence. We need the depth psychologist and the cognitive archaeologist, the explorer of archetypes and the historian of mentality, the spiritualist and the materialist, each bringing their particular insights to bear on mysteries that encompass all perspectives. In the space between their views, in the tensions and complementarities their conversation reveals, we find room to develop our own understanding. We need not choose between them exclusively, but can draw from both, recognizing the validity of eternal patterns and historical transformations of collective unconscious and evolved brain structures, of symbols that convey timeless truths and texts that document cognitive revolutions. The legacy of both thinkers is invitation rather than dogma. They ask us to pay attention to dimensions of experience that dominant paradigms ignore. They ask us to honor the strange, the numinous, the multiple, the non-rational. They ask us to recognize that consciousness is both precious and problematic, both achievement and burden, requiring frameworks and practices that acknowledge its full complexity. As consciousness emerged, whether 3,000 years ago or 3 million, it brought unprecedented possibilities and inescapable predicaments. We can plan and reflect and create in ways no previous form of life could manage. But we also suffer existential anxiety, meaning crisis, and self-alienation, impossible for creatures lacking our particular form of awareness. Any adequate psychology must address both sides of consciousness, its glories and its costs. Jung did this by mapping the path of individuation, showing how consciousness could expand to include unconscious depths without losing itself, achieving wholeness that transcends the division between conscious and unconscious. His psychology offers hope that the suffering consciousness brings serves a larger purpose, that we grow through our struggles towards something more complete and meaningful. Jaynes did this by providing historical perspective, showing that consciousness is not the only way to be human, that it emerged from and still carries traces of earlier mentalities. His psychology offers the insight that our problems are not eternal, but historically specific, that we might address them by understanding how they arose and what alternatives exist. Both legacies matter. Both invite us deeper into self-understanding and into recognition of forces beyond self that shape human existence. Whether those forces are archetypal or neurological, eternal or evolved, they exceed conscious control and require respectful engagement. The conversation between Jung and Jaynes, which we have imaginatively recreated through this long night's exploration, continues in anyone who takes up their questions seriously. In therapy offices and research laboratories, in personal journals and philosophical texts, in creative works and spiritual practices, humans continue asking what it means to be conscious, what voices speak within us, what depths or histories we carry, how we can live meaningfully. Given the psychological architecture we have inherited or developed, there are no final answers, only deeper questions and more nuanced understandings. Jung and Jaynes contributed their perspectives, shaped by their particular cultural moments and personal temperaments, their theoretical commitments, and chosen methodologies. They saw different things while looking at similar phenomena, perhaps because consciousness is large enough to support multiple valid interpretations. What remains constant is the human need to understand ourselves, to make sense of the strange experience of being aware, of carrying multiple voices within, of seeking meaning that transcends mere survival, of participating in something larger than individual ego. Whether we call that something collective unconscious or cultural evolution, whether we access it through active imagination or controlled regression to bicameral states, whether we interpret its messages archetypally or neurologically, we are reaching toward similar territories, seeking similar wisdom. The night deepens now, and conscious thought begins to loosen its grip. Perhaps sleep will bring dreams where archetypal figures speak or bicameral voices guide. Perhaps the boundary between conscious and unconscious will thin, allowing traffic between dimensions usually kept separate. Perhaps in the morning, something new will have emerged, some insight or integration that transcends the division between Jung's depth and Jaynes's history. Or perhaps sleep will simply be sleep, rest without revelation, the consciousness that has labored through this exploration subsiding into neural housekeeping and memory consolidation, the voices quieting as brain systems shift into sleep architecture. Even this would confirm what both thinkers knew, that consciousness is not constant or absolute, but rather one state among others, one way of being that alternates with different modes. Either way, the questions remain, patient and permanent, waiting for each generation to take them up again. What am I? How did I come to be conscious? What speaks within me? Where do my thoughts and impulses originate? What relationship should I maintain between awareness and depth, between ego and self, between conscious planning and unconscious wisdom? Jung and Jaynes offered different answers, but they agreed that asking the questions matters profoundly. An unexamined life, as Socrates knew, is not worth living. A consciousness that does not reflect upon itself, that accepts its own operations as transparent and self-evident, misses both danger and opportunity. We must explore the territory of psyche and mentality, must develop maps even if those maps differ and remain always incomplete. So as you drift into sleep, carry with you the spirit of exploration that animated both thinkers. Be curious about your dreams and fantasies, your impulses and intuitions. Notice when inner voices speak, whether you interpret them as aspects of your own psyche or as vestiges of ancient mentalities. Pay attention to symbols and synchronicities, whether you see in them collective unconscious patterns or the meaning-making activity of consciousness itself. Honor the multiplicity within you, the complexity that neither simple rationalism nor simple faith can fully capture. You are evolutionary product and symbolic being, historical creature and eternal soul. conscious subject and unconscious depth. You contain both ancient inheritances and modern cultural achievements, both neurological mechanisms and psychological realities that exceed mere mechanism. The conversation between Jung and Jaynes continues in you, in anyone who takes seriously the mystery of consciousness and its origins, its potentials and its limits. Their frameworks offer tools for exploration, not final destinations. Use what serves, question what conflicts with experience, synthesize when possible, hold tensions when synthesis is premature. The greatest gift both thinkers offer is permission to take seriously dimensions of experience that materialist reductionism dismisses. Your dreams matter. Your symbols convey meaning. Your inner voices deserve careful attention. Whether you understand them archetypally or neurologically, whether you see them as timeless or historical, they reveal something essential about what it means to be human in the particular way you are human. And now, as this long exploration draws toward its close, as morning approaches but sleep still beckons, let all these ideas settle like snow covering a landscape, transforming it gently, blanketing it with new understanding, while not erasing what lay beneath. The psyche Jung mapped and the consciousness Jaynes traced both continue their mysterious operations, whether we understand them or not, whether we have frameworks adequate to their complexity or not. What matters is remaining open, curious, humble before the enormity of human consciousness and its depths or histories, its multiplicities and its longings for wholeness, its rational achievements and its non-rational foundations, its historical emergence and its participation in patterns that may transcend history. Sleep now, and in sleeping, dream. And in dreaming, encounter whatever figures present themselves, whether you name them archetypes or neural phantoms, whether you engage them as eternal or recognize them as echoes of ancestral voices. Listen to what they say. Feel what they stir. Notice how consciousness itself transforms in the liminal space between waking and sleeping, how the unified ego of daylight fragments into multiplicity of dream figures and voices. This is your own bicameral space, your own encounter with autonomous complexes, your own experience of consciousness relativized and psyche revealed in its greater wholeness. This is where Jung and Jaynes both pointed, through their different maps and languages, toward the territory of human being that exceeds conscious control and rational comprehension. Rest in that territory now. Trust its ancient wisdom or evolved architecture, its archetypal patterns or historical structures. Trust that consciousness arose for reasons, that psyche organizes itself according to principles that serve life and meaning, that the dialogue between awareness and depth will continue through your sleeping hours, preparing new insights for the morning. Jung and Jaynes both devoted their lives to understanding consciousness and its relationship to what exceeds consciousness. Their dialogue, imagined or real, models the work each person must do, holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, allowing different frameworks to illuminate different facets of experience, resisting premature closure in favor of continued exploration. You carry that dialogue forward now, in your own experience, your own dreams and waking insights, your own encounter with inner multiplicity and outer mystery. Neither Jung nor Jaynes has final answers, but both asked essential questions and developed rich frameworks for exploring them. That is enough. That is the gift they offer across decades and across the divide between their different starting points. The night holds you now in its dark embrace, consciousness subsiding, other forms of mentality emerging, the eternal dialogue continuing beyond words and waking thought. Rest well, dream deep, and wake when morning comes with renewed curiosity about the mystery you are, the consciousness you carry, the depths or histories you participate in without fully comprehending. This is the territory Jung and Jaynes both explored, each in his way, each contributing perspectives that enrich our understanding even when they conflict. Their conversation continues in you, in anyone who wonders what it means to be conscious, what voices speak within, what patterns shape our being, how we can live with meaning and integrity given the psychological complexity we inherit or develop. Sleep now, and let their dialogue fade into whatever silence or sound fills your deepest rest. The morning will bring new opportunities to explore, new experiences to contemplate, new moments to practice the art of being humanly conscious in all its difficulty and possibility. For now, simply be, without trying to understand or control, accepting the mystery that you are, the consciousness that lights your days, and the depths or histories that underlie it, the multiplicity that Jung and Jaynes both recognized and honored in their different ways. The exploration continues, always continues, as long as consciousness reflects upon itself and wonders at its own nature. This night's journey through the dialogue between two great minds is complete, but the larger journey never ends, inviting each person, each generation, into deeper understanding of what it means to be aware, to be human, to be situated between time and eternity, between brain and psyche, between the conscious life we know and the unconscious depths or historical structures that make that conscious life possible. Rest now in that mystery, that permanent invitation to wonder and explore. Jung and Jaynes accompany you, not as authorities, but as companions in the eternal human project of self-understanding. Their insights light the way without determining the path. Their frameworks support exploration without constraining it. Their dialogue invites your own participation in the never-ending conversation about consciousness and its origins, its nature and its destiny, its burdens and its possibilities. Good night, fellow explorer. Dream well, and wake to continue the dialogue in your own unique way, bringing your own experience and insight to bear on mysteries that exceed any single perspective, any final answer, any complete understanding. This is how consciousness serves itself through endless reflection, through multiple perspectives held together, through humble acknowledgement that the mystery remains despite our best efforts to comprehend it. The conversation between Jung and Jaynes, which we have traced through this long night, reaches no final conclusion but opens onto further questions, deeper explorations, continued wonder. This is as it should be. This is how living psychology differs from dead dogma. This is the gift both thinkers offer, not closure but invitation, not answers but frameworks for asking better questions, not certainty but rich complexity worthy of lifelong engagement. And so this exploration ends as it must, not with resolution but with recognition that the territory is larger than any map, that consciousness exceeds our theories about it, that the dialogue between different perspectives must continue if we are to approach anything like adequate understanding. Jung and Jaynes, archetypes and bicameral voices, collective unconscious and historical transformation, eternal patterns and neural mechanisms, all these ways of understanding ourselves and our experience deserve continued attention, continued exploration, continued dialogue. Sleep now, and in sleeping, participate in the mystery both thinkers honored. Consciousness subsides but does not disappear, transforms but does not end, returns to sources that nourish and renew it. Whether those sources are archetypal depths or evolutionary structures, whether they are eternal or historical, they will hold you through the night and restore you for the morning. Trust them, rest in them, allow them to do their work beyond conscious awareness or control. This is the wisdom Jung and Jaynes both recognize, that consciousness must periodically surrender, must trust what lies beneath or before it, must acknowledge that the ego is not master but participant in larger processes. Sleep enacts this surrender nightly, reminding us that consciousness is not absolute, that we are held by forces and patterns we do not create or control. And so, wanderer of the waking world, this night's tale concludes. May your dreams be deep and your rest complete. May you wake with renewed appreciation for the mystery of consciousness and all that supports it, underlies it, gives it birth and meaning. And may the dialogue between Jung and Jaynes, which we have traced together through the darkness, continue to illuminate your own exploration of what it means to be aware, to be human, to be both conscious and so much more than conscious. Good night.